Okay, let's see. Well, you'll notice, that you have an old-fashioned chemical balance. Utilitarianism, along with Kant's ethics, which we'll not do, came out in the later part of the 19th century as more or less as answers to David Hume's skepticism about morality. We saw that David Hume was skeptical about whether we can claim we know there's a material world, whether we can claim that we know we're the same person, whether we can claim we know that there's a necessary connection between causes and their effects that enable us to say that there are universal laws of nature. But he also had skeptical views about ethics. And his views about ethics are really part and parcel of his skepticism about other things. One of the things that David Hume was trying to do was undermine the claim of people like Descartes and even Locke that we can provide rational justifications for a lot of our current beliefs. That is, that we can provide philosophical arguments that, establish them. That, of course, was what we saw Descartes was trying to do. Establish them as in as strict a way as, say, the rules of geometry establish the theorems, the rules or the axioms. So what Hume was trying to do as a skeptic, and that's why he called his first book The Treatise of Human Nature, is to say, you know what, we can't justify many of these ordinary beliefs philosophically. The attempts by philosophers to justify them by reason, to provide rational arguments that give us confidence at a deep metaphysical level that our ordinary common sense beliefs are true, Hume says we can't do that. He says we, as part of our human nature, we have to act as if things like, the law of gravity is going to hold, that there is an external material world, and that we are going to continue as the same person from day to day and week to week. But Hume says we cannot justify these philosophically. So basically his bottom line is we believe them as part of our human nature on nothing but custom and habit and emotion. And that was basically what he tried to establish about ethics. He really argued for the same sort of relativism in ethics that Sartre was arguing for. For Hume, ethics is, in his famous quote, more a matter of sentiment than reason, more a matter of feelings. In other words, if I say stealing is wrong, for Hume, I'm not telling you anything objective. He says we can't rationally justify ethical beliefs. If I say stealing is wrong, all I'm doing is reporting my inner psychological feelings about it. And so ethics for Hume boils down to nothing more than feelings, and we can't justify ethical claims rationally, you know, any more than he would say we can justify some of the other beliefs that philosophers thought had such good rational reasons in their support. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with Hume on this, but one way of looking at what people like the utilitarians were trying to do is they're trying to give us a way to talk about ethics and to reason about ethical issues rationally. And what the utilitarians say is, you know what, if we can make ethics a part of the world we live in, if we can relate it to things that we're actually in touch with in this world, rather than the kinds of things Hume challenges, like, you know, universal moral principles of the sort that Plato and Aristotle thought were around, that are beyond the realm of the senses and written into the fabric of the universe, or moral beliefs resting on the will of a supernatural being, of God. The utilitarians said, you know, those approaches to ethics are open to a lot of the kind of skepticism that Hume brings against them, that we really can't justify ethical beliefs that way. And so what the utilitarians are trying to do, because it may seem odd to talk about ethics, although we saw Aristotle talking about ethics in terms of promoting what promotes human happiness. And the utilitarians thought, well, if we can make ethics a matter of, on balance, promoting the overall good of society in terms of increasing their happiness, and what's morally wrong, what decreases happiness on balance, then we can get ethics down to earth, and we can show a way that we can go on and reason about moral right and wrong in an objective way, and we can make a response to Hume's claim that we can't reason about moral issues, that it's just a matter of one person's feelings over another person's feelings. And there are people today. I mean, I used to assign an essay in our ethics text called, that was around student subjectivism. And a lot of students believe this about ethics, and you may be one of them. You know, ethics is like a supermarket. You walk down the aisle of the supermarket and you pull off the shelves what you want, and you leave the rest on the shelves. Well, you just walk down the ethical aisle and you pick out those moral beliefs that you want to support, and the rest of them you just leave. Well, you know, the utilitarians are trying to establish a more objective basis for ethics than that. But this metaphor of the scale is important, because for utilitarianism, the way we figure out moral right and wrong is we look at the projected results or consequences of what we're going to do, and we say, well, let's suppose I'm debating, you know, what's the right thing to do, A or B? Well, I look at what seem to be the consequences of doing A versus the consequences of doing B, and the moral choice is what promotes the most happiness or the least amount of pain for utilitarianism for all concerned. And so I'm weighing, the results of my actions in order to decide what's the right thing to do. So that's, the reason for that. Now, we're not going to look at, some people, a lot of you got straight the distinction, if you did number 9, between psychological and ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is an ethical theory that also revolves around consequences. Only ethical egoism is controversial because it says that the consequences I should promote are those for me. So utilitarianism and ethical egoism fit into a class of moral views called consequentialist views. Consequentialism holds that the only factors relevant to the moral quality of an action, when I say moral quality, whether it's morally right or morally wrong, are the future results we would produce by doing it. And that's why when I did this diagram, C1, C2, etc. stand for the consequences of a given action. And note, where are the consequences of what I do today? They're located in the future, right? So utilitarianism, by focusing on consequences, is necessarily just forward-looking, and that becomes a criticism of it because it does make the past irrelevant, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So ethical egoism and utilitarianism both focus only on consequences. Nothing else about our actions is morally relevant. Only the results or the proposed future results of what we do. But to see how they differ in answering the question consequences for whom, not for you. Ethical egoism says the only consequences I ought to promote are those for myself. By the way, if you wrote on 9, the way the connection between the psychological theory and the ethical theory is often made is that ought implies can. It can't be our moral duty to do what's impossible for us. The psychological theory says we can only act selfishly in our own self-interest. So you can say, well, if our moral obligation ought to be only what we can do, then we ought to adopt ethical egoism if psychological egoism is true. If the only thing we can do is act in our own self-interest, then shouldn't that be the only thing we're required to do morally? But we're not going to focus on ethical egoism, but if you wrote on 9, I thought that's a comment in passing. But utilitarianism has gotten many more supporters. It's very hard for ethical egoism to give us a good reason why we ought to be altruistic. We ought to be altruistic only if it promotes our self-interest. Utilitarianism has a much broader view of things, and it can sustain altruistic actions much better, justify them morally. Utilitarianism answers the question, consequences for whom, W-H-O-M, by saying, well, the consequences we as utilitarians are worried about are the consequences for anyone affected by what we do. Now, do the consequences for me matter to a utilitarian? Yes, but they're just one factor in the mix, whereas for egoism, they're the only thing. For utilitarianism, the consequences for me matter, but that's only one factor. You know, I need to weigh the consequences for everyone affected by what I do. And so it can sustain altruism much better. Now, one of the appealing things about utilitarianism is it seems to be very simple to understand because it's based on one principle. Now, when we looked at Descartes, you know, about the fact that he takes cogito ergo sum, much like an axiom in geometry. Well, Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, founded utilitarianism in really the late 1700s, the late 18th century. But he thought this one principle on which the whole theory is based functioned like an axiom. Utilitarianism rests on what's called the principle of utility. And, you know, I didn't bring down your book. Bentham's original statement of it is very convoluted. But basically, here are two, one of which is from Solomon, two summaries of the principle of utility. Always act so as to bring about the greatest net good. In other words, on balance, the greatest good for all those affected by your actions. Or Solomon summarizes it this way: always act for the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or the general good of society if it's a policy. You know, I read you that thing last time where Cass Sunstein of the current administration, you know, had an executive order out there that all federal agencies should use utilitarian reasoning when assessing whether to hold on to or get rid of a policy. You know, the question is it going to produce more good than bad results? Then keep it. If the bad results outweigh the good results, then maybe ditch it. So the principle of utility then is the sole principle on which utilitarianism is founded. Now, basically, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are the two founders of this view. Mill was a disciple, a pupil of Bentham. Bentham was older than Mill. Now, look, let me go back one slide. Notice that these definitions of the principle of utility just talk about promoting the greatest good for the greatest number, but they don't tell you what you're to take as moral goodness. Now, for utilitarians, it's nothing as abstract as the commands of God, although they both argue, Mill and Bentham, that their view is not an anti-religious or anti-Christian view. Neither is it, you know, looking for the ultimate good of ethics in some, you know, established principle like Plato's form of the good. But like Aristotle, they it was a different group, the Epicureans that they looked at, but they took an old theory that had been around since the time of the Greeks, hedonism, which is the view that what is good is what promotes the greatest, what promotes happiness or pleasure, and what is bad is what either decreases happiness or results in pain or unhappiness. So note that feelings of happiness and unhappiness, pleasure and pain, are part of our day-to-day experience in the real world we live on, we live in. And so by defining moral goodness as not some abstract property, but in terms of promotion of pleasure and lessening of pain, they tried to get ethics down to earth, and by giving it this down to earth standard, wanted to make ethics something that we could once more reason. So hedonism is the view that only happiness or pleasure is good for its own sake alone. I'm not going to put the term on the blackboard, but the word ethicists use is intrinsically good. Any other good is good only insofar as it promotes pleasure or lessens pain, but not for its own sake. In other words, there are some things that are good, but only because they promote some other good. They're not good in themselves. You can say, well, it's good to eat healthy foods, right? Say, well, why? Well, people who eat healthy foods tend to be healthier and they live longer. You say, well, why do you want to be healthier? Well, one answer you can give is that people who are in good health are generally happier. They have more pleasure out of life. But if you go on to say, well, why be happy? Why should I pursue that as a goal? For the hedonist, the buck stops there. Because happiness is not something to be sought because it promotes some other good. It's something to be sought as a good in itself. So that's what they took as the ultimate standard of moral goodness. Now, again, if you're used to thinking of moral goodness in terms of the supernatural abstract commands of God, this is going to seem an odd way of doing things. But remember, what they're trying to do is get a way of talking about ethics that brings it down to the world we live in and that answers Hume's skepticism about morality, that we can't reason about a moral issue. They're basically saying, wait a second, if we take moral goodness to be what promotes, on balance, the most happiness, and moral evil, what produces less happiness or pain, then we can get ethics down to earth and we can reason about what's morally right and wrong in an objective way, and answer Hume's skepticism about morality. That yes, we can reason about moral matters. Now, I'm not going to stick on this slide. Hume tries to, not Hume, but John Stuart Mill tried to prove that that hedonism was the way to define moral goodness, but he commits a sort of logic 101 error that we call an error of ambiguity. In other words, you can't use a word with two different meanings in an argument, one meaning in the premises, another meaning in the conclusion, because basically that means that you haven't really established the conclusion you want to establish. He says that pleasure is desirable as an end, that is, as the goal of morality, can be seen from this that it is the one thing people actually do desire. People do desire happiness and pleasure. Therefore, pleasure is desirable in the same way that a sound is audible. But so that meaning basically says that pleasure is something that people do desire. It's something that people can desire, meaning wine. But if he's going to prove that pleasure is the ultimate good of ethics, he really needs to show meaning too. that pleasure is not just something that people do desire, but it's what we ought to desire as the ultimate end of morality, and he never does prove that. So, but I'm not going to ask you specific questions on that. Now, Bentham, a lot of theories, even in the sciences, start out, the person who first gets the theory out, gets it out in a very straightforward way, but then people might find some problems with it, and the theory gets more complicated as it goes along. Well, basically, Bentham measured pleasures and pains only in terms of their quantity. He placed all pleasures on the par if their quantity is the same. His famous quotation is, "Quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry." Now, pushpin evidently is an English child's game that's not too different from pickup sticks. Well, what is he saying? He's saying that all pleasures are on a par if their quantity is the same. And Bentham thought that it would be great, and he originally espoused the view that we can talk about pleasures and pains quantitatively. Now, what is it to talk about something quantitatively? We can talk about the temperature in this room quantitatively, right? I mean, there's an objective standard by which we could talk about and measure how hot or how cold it is in this room, right? By degrees Celsius or degrees Kelvin, all right? So to talk about something quantitatively means you can measure it. And Bentham held out the hope early on that we could measure pleasures and pains. Now, this turns out to be more than you can really do. And now don't let the word calculus scare you. We're not talking about the calculus that was developed by Newton and, Laplace or whatever, where if you take that subject, you have a textbook that's about 3 or 4 inches thick. But a calculus, in a more general meaning of the word, is a system within which calculations are made. And here we're not talking about anything other than adding simple positive and negative numbers. But he thought we could compare pleasures and pains, and the way we can measure temperature is because we have countable units. Believe it or not, he thought we could establish a countable unit for pleasure and pain, which he called the hedon. Now, you can't make this kind of stuff up, folks. So +1 hedon would be a unit of pleasure, -1 would be a unit of pain. And here, I'm going to try to get through this in the next 5 minutes, which I think I can do. On this slide, it gives you a very simple example that I got from the old Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the one you find in the library, comparing 2 possible actions. You're somebody who's the uncle of a young man, right? And the circus is coming up Saturday. And you're wondering, as a Benthamite utilitarian, what's the morally right thing to do? My nephew would like me to take him to the circus. I would rather not go. I'd rather just stay home and read a book I enjoy. But morally, can I figure this out? Now, again, this is a simple example. Bentham didn't think you should have to get out your calculator to find out whether to have cherry pie or apple pie for dessert. But he and Mill wanted to influence the legal system. Consider a judge that's in the sentencing phase of a trial and has to make a decision about what is a fair sentence to give a convicted criminal, where maybe years of that person's life are in the balance. Wouldn't it be good to have an objective, unbiased way to figure that out? Well, that's the kind of thing that Bentham was talking about. Or a big decision like building the Bakun Dam, or putting that building in across the street, you know, even though it's going to displace a lot of people. So real quickly, to go over these. So taking the nephew to the circus. Well, suppose the uncle has been in the circus before. For him, circus has been there, done that, boring. You know, so the uncle's going to be bored. So let's call this, I mean, boredom is like a mild pain. It's an unpleasantness. So let's call that -5 hedons. Nonetheless, sympathetic pleasure is pleasure you get out of watching somebody else enjoy something. Like if, you know, how many of you have seen a younger sibling or maybe one of your own children, they get a birthday gift or something at Christmas time, and you get pleasure out of seeing them open the gift and enjoy it. Well, that's what sympathetic pleasure is. So if I take the kid to the circus and he enjoys it, I'll get some sympathetic pleasure out of it. And also, the nephew himself, let's say, gets +10 hedons of pleasure. Well, if you add up positive and negative numbers, you've got +12 -5, which is +7 hedons. So that's option number 1. Take the kid to the circus. Option number 2, of course, is should I stay home and read a book? Well, the uncle, let's suppose he doesn't get quite as much enjoyment out of an evening of reading as a kid would from the circus. Let's call it +6 hedons. But while he's sitting there reading, he's going to have some sympathetic pain, knowing that he's caused some disappointment in his nephew, and then there's the nephew's disappointment, which is -8 hedons. So here, if you've got -10 +6, it's -4 if the thing's going to come up. And so now for utilitarian reasoning, it's not always a plus or a minus. Sometimes you can have 2 pluses or 2 minuses. But what's the morally right thing to do? Right, to take the kid to the circus. But note, if you just consider the uncle's situation, he gets less pleasure out of this one, right? Because it's -5 +2, or -3 hedons of pleasure for himself here. There, if he stays home and reads the book, it's +6 hedons worth of pleasure. But he's a utilitarian, not an egoist. And he's saying, well, what's the best for all concerned? So utilitarianism enables us to take what philosophers call the moral point of view. To stand back from a situation as if you're not affected by the decision and make your decision about what to do in an objective way. Okay, we'll pick this up Wednesday. And, you know, again, I'll post some essay questions for your exam a week from today in the office later. You'll see it on Blackboard under question pools. Okay, so we'll pick this up. You know, this PowerPoint has been there for a while. Thank you for coming, and have a good day.